I'm your host, Ralph Newell, and today we have with us, first of all, Dr. William B. Harvey, who serves as a Distinguished Scholar at the American Association for Access and Diversity, located in Washington, D.C. Dr. Harvey.
Hello, Ralph. Good to be with you.
All right. And we also have Dr. Ken Coopwood. Dr. Coop, as he's commonly referred to, is the CEO of Coopwood Diversity, Leadership, and Education Universal, also known as Coop Di Leu.
Thanks for having me, Ralph. I'm glad to be with you.
All right, good. I knew we had this scheduled, and ironically, just the other day, I was on the elevator, and guy got on, and I'm usually not a person that talks to people on the elevator, but this guy was just gung-ho to have a conversation, brother. And we started talking, and he was revealing to me that he just finished diversity certification training through a group called Icarus. And he works in the gas, oil, and pipeline industry. So he's going to be the diversity person, or at least a point diversity person at his organization. And at the time, I hadn't revealed to him what I did with diverse or anything like that. I was just, listening to him talk about it, and we were talking. And so then he asked me what I did. So I told him about diverse, and, that I've been here working with diverse in this space for over 30 years. And he was like, wow, okay. So his next thing to me was, okay, in 30 years, what have you seen changed? What has changed in this space? And I really paused and I really gave him my knee-jerk assessment that in 30 years, I said, take this with a grain of salt, but I feel like nothing has really changed. I feel like we're still talking about and covering the same issues. So, Bill, I want to throw it to you as our senior leader here. You've been at this for more than 30. I don't want to put a number on it, but if you were posed with the same question, how would you have responded to this gentleman?
I think some of what you say is correct. Well, those of us who work in this enterprise have to be somewhat disappointed at the rate of change that has occurred. Okay. It's been way too slow. It's been way too circular. We wind up fighting the same battles over and over again. And at this particular point in time, when all of the conservative political landscape is really lined up to try and reverse movement and progress on diversity and equity, it does seem like we haven't gone in place. But by the same token, I was looking at the news yesterday, and the panel of 3 college presidents who are responding to the Senate about some issues on their campus. The lead president, if you will, of course, was the president of Harvey, who is now a Black woman. Okay, So that's something certainly you would not prepared to address 30 years ago. I think if I'm correct about this, I don't think I'm too far off. There's only been one other African-American president of an Ivy League university, and that was 20 years ago. Okay. And so, yeah, progress comes slowly. It comes haltingly. It's hard fought. But yeah, there's been some progress. We've certainly seen some increases in the leadership of some of our major institutions, and smaller ones as well. When it comes to issues around access, the Supreme Court situation has thrown us back to a point that we were many years ago. I've written, as you know, fairly extensively about faculty representation, and we've made very, very little progress there. So I think there are starts and stops along the way, and the battle certainly continues to go on. There's a lot more that needs to be done. Some progress has been made, but certainly not enough.
Yeah, Bill, you mentioned, I was just looking, you've written in disclosure here about 9 columns in diverse since the Supreme Court decision. And, you definitely have your finger on the pulse of things there. So what do you think is like, I don't know, the seminal moment or the seminal thing that people need to be aware of today, as we move forward?
We're at a point where I think we really are going to have to make some clear determinations about what we stand for. When I say we, I'm talking about the institutions of higher learning themselves. I'm talking about the leaders of those institutions, and I'm talking about top leadership, chancellors, provosts, and members of the board of trustees. And we're going to have to look, I think, to the next generation of students who I believe are much more interested in and concerned about having diverse campuses than might have been previous generations might have been. So, there's some touch points here. And I think to the degree that we can get some of them to work together, we need certainly much more active and directed leadership from the folks who are the institutional leaders. I mentioned them before. But I think the reality of it, we're also going to need continuing pressure from that younger cohort of people who are students now, people who are Gen Xers, who really do believe that the necessity of changing the society is irreversibly tied to what happens in the institution of higher education. So we have been able to kind of hide behind our ideals and the illusion that these are places that are actively engaged in the change process. I haven't seen that to be the case in the 15 years that I've been working in the academy. So we need a nudge. And I think that nudge has to come from the younger generation. But I think if I were to rely on a single word in terms of what will move the needle for us as we go forward, that word would be accountability. And that's one of the reasons why I think what you and Diverse and Ken are doing is so important, because you're giving institutions an opportunity to be accountable for moving the needle forward, for helping the society progress. And some will take advantage of that. Others will shy away from it. But by doing so, they'll tell us what they're really all about.
I couldn't have even set up a better segue there. Ken, as Bill mentioned, he's talking about what we're doing together collectively between Coop Di Leu and Diverse. And in full disclosure, Diverse has partnered with Coop Di Leu to present the DOIT Certification Awards. So Ken, if you want to take a few seconds there to explain to our folks what the DOIT certification is and what that's about.
All right. Well, thank you, Ralph, for that question. And I think I like what you and Bill were talking about in terms of the past and present. The DOIT certification, to me, speaks to three important things that need to be brought forward when we talk about past and present for higher education. And that is, one is, what questions need to be asked today that weren't asked in the past or historically? What illusions about higher education infrastructure need to be addressed? In the past, just kind of existed as factual. And then what narrative needs to be changed or dismantled today that historically has been status quo, or just the way people thought or talked about how institutions function. So the DOIT certification, in that sense, it's not something that has just come out of the blue. It's not a makeshift program, nor it is a play on the words like Nike's Just Do It. It's right now, it's really both a challenge and, more importantly, a standard for institutional self-development and transformation that should be acknowledged and I believe upheld in the eyes of American higher education and the general public. So the certification operates in ways much the same as an institutional site visit, or how an institution might experience a site visit from an accreditation agency, where they don't just take the survey, provide a laundry list of activities and programs, and then consider themselves quote unquote certified. But instead, they have to respond to an array of statements about how they function, and probably just as importantly, how they think day to day about institutional business, about the value of its people, its talent, and how they recruit and retain the same. And then that information is vetted against the proof that they have that they do are actually doing what they say they're doing. So, our work together is really significant and extremely unique in terms of accountability for nationally recognized activity that gives the institution an opportunity to not just put their money where their mouth is, but to demonstrate where their investment is in terms of how the institution grows from day to day in its capacity to serve a growing and increasingly diverse student population and talent pool.
When you look at the institutions that, if I'm mistaken, we had 3, I think, that got certified last year. What stood out to you the most about what you saw last year in the institutions that were submitting for certification?
Well, the first thing is that they completed all of the questions. It sounds funny, but it's true. The number of incomplete surveys was actually far more than I anticipated, because you would think that people want to know where they are on that continuum from doing nothing to becoming a transformative certified organization. So one of the things that we pitch all the time is that even if you don't get certified, you're still going to learn something about your institution. So that's one thing that I like. They completed it, and 2, that they were willing to submit random information that supported what they said they did on a daily basis or as a matter of business in response to the survey statements. The significance of that is that they did not know which statements they would have to respond to. So it was truly a random selection, and they had no clue how the 7 reviewers in 7 different states at all different types of institutions would view their evidence. So it is a bold and courageous step forward to say, not only do we say we do this, but we can prove it, and we can prove it at random. So that stood out for me, and I think the recipients that made it last year earned their stripes.
Just to educate our audience, what were the, I know we call them the pillars, but if you could just briefly explain to the folks, what were the in that criteria we were looking at 4 different pillars. What were those pillars, and how, and what are the relations to one another there?
Yeah, the 4 pillars are designed to cover the entire campus infrastructure. So one is obvious, institutional leadership and commitment. But then you have curricular and co-curricular transformation. That's what's happening inside and outside of the classroom as a matter of everyday institutional discourse. Then you have representational diversity, which is more concerned with not just what is going on, but who is there to conduct the business of the institution. And then last but not least is campus climate, which is the totality of how a campus is experienced both by its internal constituents and its external constituents. So the pillars link by drafting, if you will, a multidimensional look at the campus and how it is structured to exert an experience that aligns with what it publicly declares as diversity or its diversity values to the for people to come and experience. So each pillar has several subcomponents that strengthen the general premise of what each pillar is supposed to be about. So, for example, if you have institutional leadership and commitment, and that being about the institution mission, vision, and its strategic plans and the documents by which it conducts business every day are not only public, but they are things that can be experienced once you set foot on campus. To make that authentic and true for every person as often as possible, there's got to be subcomponents that make that real. For example, what types of talent do you recruit to ensure that experience is created and that it stays intact? What type of investments are being used and are on the pipeline, in the pipeline, to ensure that the support for that experience never runs dry. So things like that are formulated into statements throughout the DOIT instrument. And people have to respond to those and be ready to support their answers.
Based upon all of that, Bill, if an institution reaches that level of certification, what do you think that means, or how does that play in the national landscape today, especially after the SCOTUS decision?
Yeah, I think the transition, if you will, pre-SCOTUS, post-SCOTUS, is an important point for us to focus on, because the general atmosphere, changed very much after that decision, although many of us predicted the decision would be exactly what it was, because the general political backdrop has been such over the last several years. And with the recent appointees to the court, it was not hard to presume that the affirmative action efforts were going to be pretty much severely undermined, as they were. But I think in some respects, what it does again is cause us to focus on a basic question, basic for me, from my perspective. And that is, what are these institutions supposed to do? Okay. What function, what purpose, what role does an institution of higher learning play in a democratic pluralistic society? Okay. My answer to that, which may not be one shared by everyone, is that these institutions, public or private, large or small, irrespective of location, irrespective of their fundamental foundational aspects, they exist to make the society better for the folks who come after us. Okay? If that's the case, if we accept that, then we also have to be honest about what we are doing and what we are not doing. All right? We know fundamentally that the society is going to become more pluralistic than it has been. The projections have been out there for the last 30 years or so, and we're rapidly approaching the point in which we are a majority minorities country. Okay? We also know that the history and the social institutions of this country, including the academy, have in many ways been complicit in putting certain groups of people into unfavorable positions by policy and practice. Okay? So if we recognize those realities, and they're pretty obvious, I think, okay, then the question for us, those of us within the institutions at this point in time, is what are we going to do in our institutions to try to make sure that every student, but particularly those who have been historically underserved by the society and the institutions, have as much of an opportunity as they could possibly have to develop as fully as they can, both for their own communities and for the nation at large. Now, if we take that perspective and we are honest about it, that means we're going to look at the representation of the folks who are on our faculties and our administrative staff. We're going to look at the processes by which people come into the institutions, both as students and as teachers, and make sure that those processes recognize the significant and sometimes overlooked transition points that occur, what might be called microaggressions, if you want to call it that. Okay. We want to make sure that our curricula reflect clearly and honestly what has happened historically in this country to disadvantage certain groups, and that some of those policies still exist in place, and ask ourselves what we can do about that, what our responsibility is. If, as people who work within institutions of higher education, our function and our role and our purpose is to make sure these institutions serve what we used to call the greater good, okay, the betterment of society, then we have to be honest and realistic about the changes that have to be made, and hopefully we'll step forward even in the face of these conservative political forces to make those changes that need to be made in the institution.
Bill, I think you had a very good column in Diverse. I'm not sure when this one ran, but you guys can go online and look at it. Just Google. I think you called it hypocritical race theory.
Yeah, hypocritical.
Yeah, I'm sorry, hypocritical. I'm sorry. And we talked about curriculum as one of the pillars. So, how do you see that misconception or misrepresentation of CRT as it relates to curriculum?
Yeah, and let me just say that I appreciate you saying that was a good column, although that suggests that the rest of the columns weren't as good. Yeah.
No, that one jumped out to me. That was the A+. Everything else was an A. How about that?
We have these people running around misrepresenting, intentionally in some cases, critical race theory. Okay, they really don't know what it is, or they don't care that they don't know what it is. But what they're doing is weaponizing the terminology so that anything, any conversation, any discussion, any analysis of any racial interactions, historical or contemporary, are considered to be out of bounds. How crazy is it? I mean, it's just absolutely insane. But they weaponize the concept in such a way that, again, what normally would be considered not only appropriate, but important conversations and discussions about what has happened in this country, what is happening now in this country, what will happen in this country in the future, that those conversations are circumscribed, that the analysis is limited. It's just absolutely insane on its face. And what's most disturbing about it, from my standpoint, is that the response to this from our institutional leaders has been much, much more timid than I would have expected or hoped to be the case. What we have are people who are outside, non-academicians, in many, many cases, telling us as professionals that we're not allowed to talk about the things that are important in this country in its historical development, in its contemporary analysis, and in its future progression that will, in fact, help the people that we are providing an education for do better in the future than we've been able to do in the past. They weaponize this concept of critical race theory by, in fact, completely distorting what it is and then emphasizing that distortion, leading me to say that what they're engaged in is hypocritical race theory.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's very troubling how many people were quiet about this. And then it's not a conversely, but I'm just juxtaposing these two things together. I was reading something today about all the fire that the president of, I think, is Harvard, is it MIT and maybe UPenn, if I may be saying it wrong,
right,
that they're under fire because of, what they were saying or not saying in regards to Israel and Palestine. I feel like the vitriol on this is much worse than what's happening with CRT. What do you guys think about that?
The institutional leaders who were facing Congress the other day, the representatives from Congress, I think tried to identify their institutions as being important places where people can identify and talk about things that are in many cases problematic for others to accept. Okay, so we're in the situation now where we've gotten this essentially divergence, and that's unfortunate and problematic. We should all be maintaining a very vigilant statement when anti-Semitism occurs. We should be just as vigilant when we talk about Islamophobia and just as vigilant when we talk about racism. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what the institutions, as I understood it, the presidents were saying is we have to preserve in our institutions a right for people to say things that some other people find objectionable. And that issue has been one that the institutions have been dealing with for the last several years, okay, in very, very public ways. So I sympathize with them in terms of being able to try and present their institutions as still supporting that kind of basic academic tenet, the right to raise issues and concerns that might be problematic or even objectionable to others. But I would hope that there's be some consistency in the application of that tenet to all forms of activity that discriminate against individuals because of race, sex, gender, whatever.
I just want to, sort of dovetail into some of the other pillar things. And Ken, one of the pillars we talk about representation. Obviously, that's in leadership, students, faculty, staff. But when it comes to students, this SCOTUS decision was specifically around admissions. What do you think the fallout is going to be from that, and how can institutions still try and reach out and achieve that diversity that they were looking for pre-SCOTUS decision?
Well, I think that, when you think about what is on the table now, and you think about what is being asked with regard to the DOIT certification, and trying to pull these two things together, it takes me back first to one of the points I made earlier is what questions are relevant today,
right?
When it comes to admitting students and admitting them based on the merit of their scholarship and character and value as a citizen, as opposed to the degree to which they can jump, run, and throw a football. Now, those questions are going to come up again, and I think in a more profound way, given the political landscape of the country, because in my second thought was what illusions need to be faced. And one of those illusions might very well be that we've been nursing a system of higher education that has not yet demonstrated its authentic interest and concern for students and people of color as members of the global community and society that we are trying to create for the betterment of everyone. Instead, people have been typecast, if you will, for certain roles or financial streams that have caused institutions to thrive in many cases in terms of recognition and financial gain, but not necessarily the student or even the personnel. So now we're at a stage in the evolution of institutional transformation where we need to ask what or why certain questions haven't been asked historically. We need to ask what illusions have the current infrastructures created that we now call status quo, but still lack the authentic capacity to care and demonstrate a microcosm of the larger society while within the confines of the campus. And then what should the narrative be today about what higher education represents, what it is, and historically what it has not been, that needs to be revisited, relearned, and rewritten. So I see that we're at that point, but as you two were saying earlier, not enough people have come forward yet, particularly institutional leaders, whose responsibility is to make or lead their institutions not just in the stage or status that it is or was when they arrived, but lead them to the future. And so we need institutional leaders to be futuristic in their approach to higher education now more than ever, because without that, you're not going to ask the right questions. You're not going to address the historical illusions, and you're not going to be equipped to write a new narrative. And those things are the premises of the DOIT certification. Who's willing to do that?
Right. Bill, you wrote about this post-SCOTUS decision and how institutions can still, try and achieve diversity through their recruitment. I kind of look at it in some ways that, a lot of schools have gone test optional. A lot of that happened. I mean, it was already happening, then it got accelerated with COVID, and some haven't retreated from that. And so when we look at it from the standpoint of, okay, there can no longer be race quotas, et cetera, I hate using that word, but do you think it's now, I mean, in some regards, I feel like maybe schools can honestly admit who they want, because there is, what are the criteria now?
Let me just very quickly point out, and I know you didn't mean to present this in this way, but quotas have been outlawed
right
from the standpoint, from the beginning, okay?
Right.
So institutions were never operating legally in terms of actually having quotas of students from different racial backgrounds. And every institution will say that to you, and they will say that, I think, with a certain degree of correctness. So what we've had is a process at the selected institutions, in most cases, of holistic admissions.
Right,
okay?
Exactly.
They look at every aspect of the student's background and endeavors, their engagements in various kinds of activities that benefit their community, as well as their schools themselves, involvements in various extracurricular activities and so forth, as well as grades and test scores. And so There's a tremendous amount of research out there that speaks to the specifics in which SAT scores, for example, are directly related to family income and the social capital and so forth, which in turn is highly skewed toward people of European descent because of the social and political and legal policies that the country has gone through. Okay, that probably sounds a little bit like a presentation on critical race theory, and it may very well be, but that's the whole point. We have to look at the whole picture from the beginning to get a better understanding of where we are now, and then to identify the changes that we need to make in order to make things better. The Supreme Court decision is unfortunate on so many levels, but I think what it does or could do, Ralph, is to open up a range of new approaches and engagements and partnerships that institutions, for whatever reason, have not taken the initiative to introduce over the past several years. Okay, I'm talking about connections with community agencies that, in fact, support kids, particularly in underserved communities. I'm talking about connections with religious houses. We know that the Black church is a fundamental social institution in the Black community. So better approaches and more effective outreach into those institutions, fraternities and sororities, okay? But also would like institutions to, I think this is what the point that Kim was making, be both creative and futuristic and begin those engagements and connections at a much earlier point than the senior year in high school, all right? This helps to shape the development of young people as they're going into and through middle school. Explain to them what college is all about and what they need to do in order to get there. There's just so much tremendous opportunity and capability in Black and brown communities that not only is untapped, but is undersupported, okay? And if the institutions reach out to those kids and their parents and the people in their community at an earlier point to help them understand how they get to college, what the benefit is of going to college, and how they can be successful once they're in college. In a generation or two, I would argue, we can substantially increase the numbers of successful college matriculants and graduates from Black and brown communities.
That's going to start, obviously. I mean, a lot of places can start, but I think one of the big places is with our institutional leadership. So, Ken, I know you talked about accountability earlier. How can we hold the institutional leaders accountable for this?
Well, when I think about what it takes for accountability, and I think about a couple of things. One, what makes an institution or a leadership team care enough about how that institution is experienced to revisit that experience, relearn how the experience was created, and then reform after that assessment what does not work, and then create what should work or what should be in place. So when we think about what would make a institutional leader do that, well, obviously that's $1 million question. But when I think of what is futuristic and transformative diversity, leadership, and education, that is a fundamental question, is why would a person lead an institution toward the future as opposed to manage its current condition or status? And that's where the nexus is. That's where the talent void is. That's where maybe the courage void is. That's where the institutional, or I didn't mean to say institutional, but the legislative leadership void is. Okay? And so what we want to do is try to shift the wheat, if you will. Find the leaders who dare go forward for the greater good of society, and the ones who don't need to be somehow removed from office or provided less responsibility as a leader. Okay, and so when you do things like you're bold enough to do it for the right reason, and that is first to find out where you are, where you've been, and why you've been there. It says that your institution is willing to be held accountable for what it has done, okay, for the historical and in some cases even punitive damages to the development of people that have crossed the stage for graduation or have come for more professional experience and have left with less experience to become a more diverse and effective professional in a increasingly global society, or a student who now has a professional need to transfer his or her skill and talent and knowledge across cultural lines. So those are significant voids that need to be recognized first and then rectified in terms of what goes into the pool of resources, investments, and effort to make institutions what they should be for the 21st century. So making a leader today is as much about, I think, attracting the authenticity of that leader as it is the leader's skill set. And we need to find a way to shift through the character of the leadership in higher education. And when we do that, that includes dealing with the thought life of that leadership. Just a quick story for me on that end. I've worked at institutions where I've had the leadership say, I don't want to be asked this question. Where in your history have you been an advocate or demonstrated leadership for people who don't look like you? Where has that been demonstrated in your history? And people who run from that, they automatically give you a red flag that they are not a person who should be leading an institution. But too many of them are sitting in a seat even today.
Bill, Ken is talking about, internal change and leadership. Externally, where do you see that leadership needs to come from?
I would hope, again, that leadership would come from the folks who are in the positions that they are because they've been endorsed by some body politic. I'm talking about elected officials now. Okay. But I also know at the same time that the way the politics are running right now, it's pretty clear that there is a fairly significant portion of the population that's not interested in seeing any substantial social change, particularly in regard to racial progress. So I think we have to continue to engage in the political arena and try and identify and put people in the office who do recognize that change is going to come, and hopefully that we'll try and make that change as positive as possible for all parties concerned. But one of the things I also recognize, Ralph, is that there are smaller subgroups that are often overlooked or not identified clearly that can have an impact on change. I'm talking about people who impact the general set of ideas. Let's call them public intellectuals. Okay, a coach, for example. Okay, a Kendi, for example. Okay, folks who are willing to step out there and take a position that, in many cases, is demonstrably not only unpleasant but almost incredibly antagonistic to many portions of the population. We talk about the significance and the prevalence of racism, for example, and the means by which that needs to be addressed by all parties in the country, everyone in the population. That's obviously going to set some people off in a very negative kind of reaction to that. So, it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. But I think public intellectuals are really important, maybe more so now than they have been at many points in the past. But I want to zero in on a population that's often overlooked, and those are alumni of predominantly white institutions. And I've said something about this in one of the columns that I wrote. I think that for those folks like myself, who in fact have had their education, undergraduate and or graduate education, in what is now called a predominantly white institution, for those folks to be able to come together and articulate the concerns and the issues that they have for the contemporary student populations and contemporary faculty of those institutions can be a tremendously important voice that the leadership needs to hear. And we all know that one of the most effective means of getting people's attention is by either putting money on the table or withholding that money. So I argued in diverse issues in one of my columns for alumni of predominantly white institutions to come together as a body to raise the concerns about what the campus environment is in regard to the treatment and conditions that folks of color have to face, by my students and faculty and administrators. And then to be very, very clear in terms of either pledging their support or withholding their financial support to the institution based on whether or not they see changes, meaning improvements in the environments. The very fact that when you survey students of color on almost every predominantly white institution in the country, they will point out to you that they are, in many cases, mistreated, that they are overlooked, that the circumstances that they have to endure are not ones that are pleasant for them. In many cases, are ones that are antithetical to their best development. So having the institutions respond to that is important. And having alumni explain to them why it's important can be, I think, most effectively achieved by also bringing the power of the purse into play. Saying that, yes, we're going to continue to support this institution through our financial contributions, or we're not going to do that, depending on whether the institutions are responsive to the articulated needs of people of color in those environments.
Oh man, I mean, gosh, just put the nail in the coffin. I won't name schools, but my daughter is at the same institution, undergrad, that I went to undergrad, and we talk about things, and some of the stuff she's talking about, like, man, it's just the same issue. It goes back to my elevator conversation of 30 plus years ago. Some of this stuff is still the same.
Right.
But it's scary and positive at the same time. We're getting close to the end here, and you mentioned, Bill, you're talking about the legislature, or Ken, one of you guys said that. But one of the last things I want to end with here is what advice and I go to each of you, do you have for people at institutions where the legislature is passing laws or policies that is rendering them ineffective, if you will? I mean, I just read an article today, I think it was, where I think a gentleman was talking about he was leaving his tenure job at Florida because he just didn't feel it was a place he could teach anymore. I get that, but we still need, as they say, boots on the ground. So what do you say to those people that are still there as to how they can fight the battle?
To stay as long as you can and do as much as you can. Okay. I mean, there is a limit to everybody's capability to make change in the environments that they're working in. And obviously you have both personal and financial considerations as well as your own mental health. Okay. Mm-hmm. But, one of the great influencers on me in my career was my engagement and my friendship with Julian Bond. We were both at the University of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And Julian used to share with me some stories that were just mind-blowing about the efforts and the activities and the courage of people whose names we will never know, as he often said to me, who were so instrumental in the civil rights movement in facing circumstances that were in many cases even a life-threatening. So we all have to identify what our own individual level of contribution is, and we all have a limit that we understand and know better than anybody else. But for folks who are in these institutions who can stay and who can make a difference, I would say organize, find support, both again within and without the institutions, because it's going to be difficult. There's no question about that, but it's always been difficult. So do as much as you can for as long as you can, and also endorse and support folks who are coming behind you, because the struggle is long to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ken?
Yeah, I'd certainly echo those points, but I also add that when I talk with, I mentor a lot of diversity professionals who are still sitting in the seat. And I said, you got to recognize that protecting yourself is more than just your mental self. You need your financial wellness is important. Your emotional wellness is important. Sometimes your physical wellness, is important. And so you got to have a plan to safeguard those things while you're in the seat. And you got to care for yourself well enough in those ways so you're not on pins and needles, even while you're driving to your workplace. You got to know what you will do when crisis comes sitting on your lap and how you will respond when it comes to protecting yourself, your career, or even your family. You got to be ready for that because at a moment's notice, you may get some notice that there's suddenly a layoff or there's suddenly no money to continue your role. So you need to be prepared for that and act like it's going to happen tomorrow. And that way you won't be surprised. And then in terms of, I think of the people who are behind these policies and the administrations or the party or whatever it may be. And, one of the articles that I have written recently has to do with you can't lead what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really about gaining an authentic perspective about what your policy is doing to people who don't look like you, who have not had the same social experiences or development or education or exposure as you, and better understand whether or not you are contributing to society or you are actually shrinking society to the point where people will have more difficulty finding their place. I believe that if a person can authentically be engaged in a way that educates them about their degree of credibility behind their policies and bills, then somebody might have a heart enough to engage in some type of reform. Until that time, until there's a mandated some type of exposure before people get into office, we'll continue to have people who legislate from afar.
Right.
Yeah, so we have to do something about that and raise the bar for the criteria to get into office.
Okay. Hey, gents, I appreciate your time. And I know part of this we did want to talk about the DOIT certification. So the last thing I'll ask Ken is, for those institutions that are listening to this, whether it be a week from now or a year from now, who want to get help in how to get certified, how can they reach out? How can you assist?
Well, Coop Di Leu is always ready to help. We've had some people call us as well. Again, the DOIT certification is a gallant, a valid, and a courageous step. It's something you should do whether you gain certification or not. If you fall short, let Coop Di Leu help you. And we have been around for a long time, and as the authors of that instrument, who better to help you understand what's a good, not just a good response to the statement, but what needs to be behind the statement in terms of authentic proof and infrastructural transformation. We can help you do that. So we're at coopdileu.com, COOPDILEU.com. Let us hear from you because we want you to get that certification.
And let me just say this, Ralph, if I might, because we know that there are lots of states, too many states, let me put it this way, where the legislatures have either already taken action or appear to be moving to take action to limit or even to remove diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and offices and policies on the public institutions in their state. So this is a chance for the private institutions in the states to demonstrate that they still understand the importance of having diverse learning environments. It's also an opportunity for all institutions in those states that are not so backward, that don't have those legislative officials moving to curtail the kind of environments that we all would hope we would find in the institutions, to step forward and recommit themselves to the importance of having diverse learning environments. So I think it's a great opportunity for institutions to show us exactly what they're all about.
No, I couldn't agree more. It even could become a a recruiting tool.
Absolutely.
To be honest,
Absolutely.
at the end of the day.
Sure.
So, hey, gentlemen, I thank you for your time, and with that, we will end this session.